broadcasting from the studios of WKEN, where every day it's the weekend. It's the Ken Calvert Show with your host, Ken Calvert.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the casual studios of WKEN, where every day it's the weekend. Coming up on today's podcast, I will chat up George Carlin going back to 1998. The paperback version of Brain Droppings had just been released, and George was in town promoting it. It's coming up. That one ranks very high on my list of faves. So that's coming your way. I want to thank you for all the great feedback on my last podcast. Got a lot of action on Facebook and Twitter. By the way, I'm supposed to remind you, me reminding me to remind you to like my fan page, The Ken Calvert Show, on Facebook. So if you wouldn't mind, if you're hanging around Facebook, do that for me. I want to thank you all for, like I said, the great feedback on Twitter as well. Radio in Detroit has always been great. And I'm thrilled to take you back to those days and share what I do remember with you. More and more of it's coming back as we go through this process. It's fun for me, and I'm glad I'm laying it down on tape for my own sake and saving. But first, I want to share this with you. Had my teeth cleaned today, and as Soupy Sales used to say, be true to your teeth and they'll never be false to you. That's right, that's what he said when we were little kids at lunch with Soupy. Whenever I have my teeth cleaned, by the way, I feel like I just had my car washed. Let me explain that to you. I know that's kind of a stretch, isn't it? Whenever I get my car washed, I want to just drive it home because we live in Michigan and the weather changes all the time. I want to just bring it home, park it in the garage, and leave it because it's clean. I like looking at my clean car. Same thing for some reason I was thinking today about my teeth being cleaned. I wanted to come home and eat nothing but drink water. I just wanted to drink water because my teeth were so clean. Does that make sense to you? But by the way, it took me about 5 minutes to lose that feeling and get all over some breakfast. No problem there. So I'm sitting there in a dental chair, by the way, with my little paper bib on, listening to The Blend on Sirius XM. That super safe dentist or doctor's office radio station. More so in the dentist office. Sad and slow, daunting love songs like Summer Breeze, She's Gone. A lot of Paul Simon, James Taylor, a lot of stuff like that. Anyway, in my last podcast, I was talking about my very first radio gig at W4 in 1973, and it got me thinking about how whenever there was never a radio topic, when you were just sort of like desperate for any topic, you could always go to the My First Blank drill. You know, My First 45. Say, kids, what was your first album? When was the first time you remember going to McDonald's? There's tons of them, My first car, all of that. I guarantee you, they light up the phones. You wouldn't believe it. So while my hygienist was humming along to Africa by Toto, I started to think about my first actual radio, the one I could hold in my hand and listen to. And I got it in the 3rd or 4th grade from my dad. He gave it to me, and it was called a Harpers Pocket Radio. Look that up. Google it. It's called a Harpers Pocket Radio. Didn't have a battery. It didn't have a cord. Well, it did have 2 cords. One was an alligator clip that you had to put on something metal, and the other was like just this single earphone that you would put in, and it was awesome. It should have been called the MacGyver when I think about it. My dad figured it out. He knew that I was really into radio, just listening to radio, so he moved me along into a nicer transistor radio that actually took a C battery, and this one had a speaker. The old Harper didn't have a speaker. You could only listen to the radio with a little earpiece in, okay? So as a kid, I would lay awake in bed listening to radio stations from all over the country. It was wild. At night, you could just travel, time travel, and I'd listen to WLS and CFL in Chicago, KDKA in Pittsburgh, WBZ in Boston, radio station in St. Louis called KMOX. I got to tell you something, it just set me free, and that, my friends, is when the radio bed bug bit. Try saying that fast, Ken. Radio bed bug bit. And that's when the radio bed bug bit. Good job. I was just having a great time, and I would hear voices from all over the place. Top 40 music calling a ball game, or people doing talk shows, late night talk shows. And I'm like 9 and 10 years old. Well, I've already told you about my early days of radio, and I have a ton more, but today I want to stay with radios because there's quite an evolution going on here. A lot of you will remember these days if you're around my age, and that is in my mid-60s. Not afraid to admit that for any reason. But my folks, like a lot of you my age, probably had like the TV, radio, record player console in the living room. That was a do not touch at our house, man. You did not go near that thing. That belonged to my dad and my mother, but it was my dad's, and you didn't go near it. Yeah, right. The minute they were out the door, that bad boy was up and on. And WABX would be cranking. That was my best source for stereo. The only way I could hear stereo. I just had to remember to put it back on AM and WJR so that my dad thought I was getting away with something. Then, fortunately, transistor radios evolved into AM/FM transistor radios. Ta-da! Life was now really good. But we had an issue, folks. We had a problem here, and that problem was called my car, or the one I shared with my sisters. I shared my mom's 1964 Robin's Egg Blue Corvair with my two sisters, and I got it probably more than they did. They didn't want to drive it. Fine with me, it was ugly as hell. What a bizarre car that was. The interior always smelled like a lawnmower with its choke wide open, no matter what. So I'm rolling along in music and song, but I want stereo. You see, most cars in the mid-60s had FM, but they only had one small speaker, and it was usually right in the center of the dashboard. Okay, what do? Tell me, Ken, what do? Enter Mickey Shore. Or as Arthur P. used to say in the commercials, Mickey! So I'm saving up all my dough that I'm making at Kroger, and I head over to Mickey Shore, and I pop in, oh yeah, the new Pioneer radio with 2 Pioneer speakers. Oh yeah, that was going to get it done. In both the doors, I could only afford a pair. It was kind of pricey, but I was done. All done, right? Wrong. I had to have an 8-track. You see, at this point, I had to be traveling with my own hand-picked tunes. My jams. One of my favorites was Grand Funk's Closer to Home. Had that one on 8-track. I had a bunch of them. I had a box with about 12, maybe even more in there. And if you don't remember an 8-track sound, the track would end while the song was playing, and it would have this like, and then it would pick back up where it left off. Very bizarre, but it was cool, and you could carry around your own music. Now, this was before cassettes, and obviously way before CDs. CDs came out in 1982. Anyway, the 8-track was like very cool, but very weird. By the way, in September 1965, the Ford Motor Company introduced factory-installed and dealer-installed 8-track tape players as an option on 3 of its 1966 models, the Sporty Mustang, the Thunderbird, and the luxurious high-end Lincoln Continental. And RCA Victor introduced 175 8-track cartridges from its RCA Victor library. In 1979, you'll find this interesting. 1979, it took that long. The FM audience levels finally surpassed that of AM. Yep, FM has been the dominant side of the dial now for over 40 years. So there you have it. We're all done. Now let's get on to George. Oh, wait a minute. I'm forgetting something. We had to go out and get the bad boy big daddy of them all for what? For where we lived. Yeah, it could have been a dorm room, sure. Might have been your frat house, of course. Might have been your apartment with some roommates, yeah? gotta have the stereo hi-fi going. How many times you think you heard, "Turn it up"? There's a website I want to draw your attention to. It's called dangerousminds.net. dangerousminds.net. They've done a really cool thing. They put together the typical 1981 system that a lot of us had in our apartments, our homes, our dorms, wherever it might be. And it featured components from Cerwin-Vega, Hitachi, Philips, and Audio-Technica. Now, the cost of that back then, and it was a lot, imagine it prorated to today. Back then, that setup would cost $829. I used to love to shop at Tech Hi-Fi. Tech Hi-Fi, yeah, that's where I used to like to buy my gear. I used to love to just go in there and browse and kind of do the Wayne Campbell. Oh, yes, someday you will be mine. But we weren't quite done yet. We had to do one final thing to get the ultimate sound when we were hanging around, chilling, or doing what we do best, and that is a whole lot of nothing. We had to get a great pair of quality headphones. It was Koss, Sony, Sennheiser, and AKG. And to this day, I continue to be a Sony guy, the headphones that I'm wearing right now. So the next time you're around somebody my age in their mid-60s, just ask them if they remember their first radio or their first stereo. That's all you have to do. And I'll bet you hear one heck of a great story. And once again, remember, if you're doing radio and you run out of content, all I have to do is open up the phones and say, "Do you remember your first?" And you can go ahead and fill in the blank. So, let's get to today's guest, George Carlin. I had a chance to interview George Carlin a number of times. As a matter of fact, one time, he needed a ride to the airport and was going to take a cab, and I said, "No problem, George. I'll take you." Comedy genius, great guy. And it was a real punch in the proverbial gut when George Carlin died in 2008. He was only 71 years of age, so as always, I want to thank you for listening. Tell a friend, please, and don't forget to check me out at Ken Calvert Show on Twitter and The Ken Calvert Show on Facebook, and like me on there, will you? Okay, thank you. See you soon, everybody. Here's George Carlin.
George Carlin is my guest. Welcome back to the great city of Detroit.
Thank you.
How are you?
Pretty good.
Life is very good.
Yes, yeah, except for some troubles last year, but everything's a lot better now.
Yeah, and our hearts and prayers still go out to you, George Carlin, the loss of your wife. Brain droppings, I must tell you, I was on my way to Caesars in Tahoe, the 4th of July. You were appearing at Caesars Tahoe, and I picked up a copy of Brain Droppings, and the flight attendant had to ask me to put the book down. As a matter of fact, because I was disrupting the rest of the aircraft.
Well, that's good.
How long does it take you to put a book together?
Well, I had a lot of existing files of things that were in certain stages of development. Some things were needed more work, some only a little work. So I don't know, I guess 8 weeks.
That's about it.
Yeah, because I had a lot of things.
And now in paperback, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, it did very well in hardcover for a year now. It sold 360,000 hardcover.
And that's something.
Got up to number 4, spent 18 weeks on the Times list, and now it's back at number 10 in the softcover.
And actually, I go to the internet and bring up Borders, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon. And, of course, we can even save money by going through the internet. As a matter of fact, the list price, $10.95. Our price, $8.76.
Okay, with a big sign.
You did radio for a few years.
4 years of radio, yes.
Did you draw from that on stage? In other words, did any of that radio background help you on stage?
Well, all of the things I did on stage between 62 and 70, which was when I began as a single, were all based on media spoofs. And a lot of them were radio, all television, radio, and movie spoofs. So there was some radio, and The Wonderful Wino was somewhat autobiographical, having been in on the ground floor at Top 40 Radio back in '56.
And the Hippy Dippy Weatherman. And
Yeah. Well, of course, that was a spoof of news, sports, and weather, which is something I wasn't in, really.
When you were growing up and you were hanging out and either listening to long-playing records, comedian-wise, who were you listening to?
Well, when I was... there were two waves of this. When I was young, really small, it was the movie comedians and the radio comedians. And it was Danny Kaye, Bob Hope, Red Skelton in the movies, and a little later Jerry Lewis was kind of a transitional one. And then the radio comedians, of whom there were many. Then the later surge was in the 50s when comedy changed forever. And that was the era of Lenny Bruce, Maud Saul, Lord Buckley, Nichols and May, Bob Newhart, Dick Gregory. So that group influenced me at a different level when I was emerging into comedy.
Did you ever get into people like Myron Cohen or any of those?
Well, I enjoy most comedians, not all. It's a very subjective thing. Okay. But I never got into them to the level of buying their LPs or anything. I just would see them on Sullivan or something.
And you will agree that most comics today followed you closely and a lot emulate you, imitate you. Well, and I think you basically changed stand-up as we know it today.
Well, I don't, that's something it's easier for people on the outside to see or comment on. I don't get the sense of that. People tell me there are a lot of comedians but all I did was go walk through the doors that other people had opened earlier for the people like Richard Pryor and myself. And then whatever doors we inadvertently opened that other people walked through, that's fine. I think the only thing I might have brought to comedy in my kind of like breakthrough in the 70s, my second wave sort of, was just trusting yourself and your own feelings about what it is you wanted to talk about, to make it more like art than entertainment.
And observations, obviously. And when do you decide that something is good enough or deserves to be in the act?
Well, you use the word observations. I've drawn from more than that. That's always been a small part of my show. I draw primarily on the English language, speaking patterns and habits, words and phrases, things we say, and then the small world, which is what some people call observational, the world of everyday experience that we all know. And then I like the larger things. I never work topical. I hate topical humor, but I do work in a sense of a social context of what's going on and how we are and who we are. So that's the big world. And those three areas have been things I always drew from. Things just suggest themselves. I have copious files, and I look at them a lot, and I rearrange, and I revise, and I update, and I do a lot of things, and I'm always adding notes. But there are just certain things that kind of you say, time to do this, to get this on out, because I do an HBO every 2 years, and that's my aim, just to write for the HBO shows.
There are things probably in those files that we've never heard.
Yeah, there are things
that you don't think, they were okay, but...
No, it's not that. You can't get to them. They're fine. They would work wonderfully, but there are other things that are more important to me to do. Brain Droppings, the book. That book was a product of having so much in the files that I looked at the files and said, I'll never live long enough to do all these. And some of them aren't really powerful and strong enough for my style on stage. My style is very strident and bombastic and energetic, and there are some observations that are sweeter, more innocent, and deserve a softer context, which I don't provide on stage, so they could never be used there, and I have to use them in print.
Obviously, another Brain Droppings coming.
Yeah, it'll be a little while yet. I have 2 books to do, and I have an HBO show coming. Then I have 2 HBOs I want to do also. Number 11 coming in February, and number 12 in the year 2001.
No regrets.
Well, no, I never killed a policeman with a Phillips head screwdriver. That's the only thing.
Thanks, George.
Thanks, Q.
Like to talk a little bit about baseball and football. Starting with baseball. Baseball is different from any other sport in a lot of different little ways. For instance, in most sports, you score points or you score goals. In baseball, you score runs. In most sports, the ball or the object is put in play by the offensive team. In baseball, the defense puts the ball in play, and only the defensive team is allowed to touch the ball. In fact, in baseball, if an offensive player touches the ball intentionally, he's out. Also, most sports, the team is run by a coach. In baseball, the team is run by a manager. And only in baseball does the manager or the coach have to wear the same uniform the players do. Can you picture Bill Parcells in his New York Giants uniform? Now, baseball and football are different from one another in other kind of interesting ways, I think. First of all, baseball is a 19th century pastoral game. Football is a 20th century technological struggle. Baseball is played on a diamond, in a park, the baseball park. Football is played on a gridiron in a stadium, sometimes called Soldier Field or War Memorial Stadium. Baseball begins in the spring, the season of new life. Football begins in the fall when everything is dying. In football, you wear a helmet. In baseball, you wear a cap. Football is concerned with downs. What down is it? Baseball is concerned with ups. Who's up? Are you up? I'm not up. He's up. In football, the specialist comes in to kick. In baseball, the specialist comes in to relieve someone. In football, you receive a penalty. In baseball, you make an error. Whoops! Football has hitting, clipping, spearing, blocking, piling on, late hitting, unnecessary roughness, and personal fouls. Baseball has the sacrifice. Football is played in any kind of weather. Rain, sleet, snow, hail, mud. Can't read the numbers on the field, can't read the yard markers, can't read the players' numbers. The struggle will continue. In baseball, if it rains, we don't come out to play. I can't come out to play. It's raining out. Baseball has a 7th inning stretch. Football has the 2-minute warning. Baseball has no time limit. We don't know when it's going to end. We might have extra innings. Football is rigidly timed, and it will end even if we have to go to sudden death. In baseball, during the game in the stands, there's kind of a picnic feeling. Emotions may run high or low, but there's not that much unpleasantness. In football, in the stands during the game, you can be sure that at least 27 times you were perfectly capable of taking the life of a fellow human being. Preferably a stranger. And finally, the objectives of the two games are totally different. In football, the object is for the quarterback, otherwise known as the field general, to be on target with his aerial assault, riddling the defense by hitting his receivers with deadly accuracy, in spite of the blitz, even if he has to use the shotgun. With short bullet passes and long bombs, he marches his troops into enemy territory, balancing this aerial assault with a sustained ground attack which punches holes in the forward wall of the enemy's defensive line. In baseball, the object is to go home and to be safe. I hope I'll be safe at home. Safe at home.
You can subscribe to the Ken Calvert Show podcast on Apple iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, or iHeartRadio. It's also available by going directly to www.thekencalvertshow.com. You can reach Ken at kencalvertpodcast@gmail.com. The preceding program is the property of Ken Calvert and may not be rebroadcast without the written permission of Ken Calvert.